Ready. I'd like to thank the FDA for the opportunity to provide comment today. My name is Russell Hosfeld, and I have no conflicts of interest here. For the last 8 years in my capacity as a journalist, I have followed the developments of the sponsor organization, Lykos Therapeutics, or as it was known until earlier this year, MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. When I initially began covering Lykos, I thought I was aligned with the goals to legalize and destigmatize psychedelics. After years of reporting on Lykos, however, I now fear that it would be irresponsible to endorse this company to roll out a radically new pharmaceutical and therapeutic intervention to the world. Over the last 8 years, I've been demonstrably lied to by Lykos's team on multiple occasions. I've fielded disclosures of sexual abuse that happened on Lykos's watch. I've observed gross mishandling and misrepresentation of clinical trial data. I've seen evidence that leadership sexually and financially exploited donors, and I've cataloged Lykos's long-term strategy to mainstream its interventions through appeal to the VA and the DoD, while simultaneously exploiting its own volunteer veterans. Because the political strategies of Lykos have largely revolved around centering veterans in public relations, I wanted to highlight the words of some of the vets who volunteered with Lykos and whose stories of mistreatment I cataloged during reporting I conducted in 2022. Slide change, please. One military police veteran worked with Lykos and told me, "I watched as Lykos and its researchers used veterans up and discarded them as soon as they no longer served a useful purpose, regardless of mental health consequences or social implications." Slide change. One Navy veteran told me of a number of instances in which he felt veterans were paraded around, used as props, and exploited for free labor. Slide change. And a Marine veteran felt that the company leadership essentially stole his research and kicked him off of his own project, saying, "If this mistreatment by Lykos is happening to me, it concerns me about the population that Lykos will be working with moving forward. Working with Lykos has been very, very crushing to me as an individual and as a veteran." Further details about these stories can be found in my written comment on the FDA website. In conclusion, I agree with these veterans who worry about the incredibly vulnerable patients that Lykos intends to work with if it receives approval for MDMA-assisted therapy. The organization has demonstrated time and time again that it is willing to play fast and loose with data and with people's lives. I do not trust Lykos to spearhead a new industry of psychedelic pharmaceuticals, and I ask that the FDA think hard on the potential consequences of allowing this company to move forward with approval. Thank you for your time.
For the record, you have 3 minutes.
My name is Neşe Devenot, and I'm a researcher at Johns Hopkins University with expertise in psychedelic bioethics. I co-authored a citizen petition to extend the open public hearing at this meeting. Lykos claims its training program will reduce the risk of boundary violations by teaching the specific psychological intervention from its clinical trials, but the clinical trials failed in this regard. This committee has been misled by Lykos to believe that this intervention was non-directive and empathetic. Next slide. Lykos has obscured its actual intervention in its submissions to the FDA. This intervention is acknowledged in this 2015 paper by founder Rick Doblin. Next slide. Doblin admits that Lykos's entire therapeutic approach is based on Stanislav Grof's spiritual teachings, and that the essence of that treatment approach is a death-rebirth process. Although this specific intervention isn't in any of the briefing documents that were submitted to the committee, it is associated with identifiable patterns of harm across Lykos's clinical trials. Next slide. Lykos's intervention is described more fully in the book Integral Psychedelic Therapy. 2 of its 3 editors were Lykos trainers and phase 3 therapists, and it was endorsed by prominent members of Lykos's inner circle. Next slide. In this book, Veronica Gold, a Lykos supervisor, trainer, and phase 3 therapist, describes pinning down a patient as their distress escalated to the point of shouting, quote, "Go away, get your effing hands away from me," end quote. But Gold did not stop. As demonstrated by the many Lykos therapists who endorse this abusive practice, this is an accepted component of the intervention that Lykos presented to this committee as necessary for positive patient outcomes. Next slide. Lykos would like this committee to believe that significant boundary violations were limited to a single phase 2 participant. Although this participant enlisted the media to draw attention to the dangers of Lykos's therapy, the components of her on-camera physical assault are still explicitly taught as part of Lykos's intervention. Next slide. After submitting my 17-page written comments to this committee, I was connected with a phase 3 participant whose PTSD symptoms were exacerbated by Lykos's clinical trial. I learned they were under the care of therapist Veronica Gold, and they continue to experience flashback nightmares of the specific intervention that Lykos expects this committee to support. Next slide. Lykos argues that its training will ensure that boundaries are maintained, but its intervention heightens risks for participants by incentivizing boundary violations. In addition to gross violations in phase 2, previously unreported violations include Lykos's senior leadership having sexual encounters with a vulnerable individual who was then recruited into phase 3. The most significant harms in Lykos's clinical trials were not caused by MDMA, but by the people who were entrusted to supervise its administration. If the committee would like additional information, I'm happy to provide it. Thank you.
Please state your name and introduce yourself. Please state your name and organization for the record. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Michael Abrams from Public Citizens Health Research Group, and I have no financial conflicts of interest on this matter. The committee today is mainly evaluating the treatment-associated experiences of about 170 participants who took part in the placebo-controlled efficacy studies, and about 470 individuals whose data were used to consider methamphetamine as a psychotherapy-enabling treatment for PTSD. The two pivotal randomized clinical trials were functionally unblinded and thus likely biased towards favorable drug effects. Patients and therapists likely knew who received the drug, and anecdotes suggest some therapists abused that knowledge to manipulate patient beliefs. Despite reluctantly green-lighting these trials, the FDA's briefing materials for this meeting said this, quote, "The contribution of the likely expectation bias cannot be discounted, while it also cannot be quantified. For the primary outcome in both trials, statistical estimates of a 9-point difference in one trial and a 12-point difference in the other favoring the drug treatment did not or only barely achieve the 10-point difference the FDA agreed represents the low end of meaningful improvement in PTSD-related symptoms. Moreover, the pivotal trials were confounded by the inclusion of imprecisely defined multi-hour psychotherapy sessions. To quote the FDA briefing materials another time, quote, "The contribution of psychotherapeutic support sessions to the overall efficacy results cannot be fully quantified or understood," close quote, even as the results show that both the drug and the placebo-exposed patients improved markedly, though variably. Adverse events that were markedly more prevalent with the drug treatment compared to placebo included blurry vision, gastrointestinal disturbances, thermal regulation disturbances, acute blood pressure increases, headache, dizziness, tremor, psychiatric symptoms such as insomnia, and of course, the abuse and dependence potential of the treatment are well established in human and animal studies. Thus, as the FDA briefing materials state, it is particularly concerning that, quote, "the applicant did not appropriately document central nervous system-related adverse events," close quote, as advised by the agency's controlled substantive staff. Based on the available evidence and considering the main deficiencies of this drug application, the known benefits of methamphetamine to treat post-traumatic stress disorder, those benefits are insufficient to outweigh the many risks. Thus, Public Citizens Health Research Group urges this committee to vote no on the voting questions before you and to recommend the FDA that MNDA not be approved. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sife Tayo Harvey. I'm the Executive Director of the People of Color Psychedelic Collective. My organization provides education and community outreach to those interested in learning about psychedelics and ending the war on drugs. I've worked in the broader drug policy reform field for 11 years. In those 11 years, I worked as Rick Dobble's assistant at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies for 8 months in 2015. Despite my poor treatment as an employee, I'm grateful to MAPS for pioneering a movement around psychedelic healing in clinical settings. I believe part of the reason why we're here is the question surrounding the efficacy of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people with PTSD. But I also think the other part of the reason why we're here is because this is the first time, in my opinion, that advocates have had the space to share and have others engage their concerns. There's a tendency in the psychedelic community to shy away from critiques or confrontations. This hearing may not have been as bustling had leaders in the field address some of the questions speakers are bringing up today. I consider a lot of the speakers colleagues, and one common theme between us is that we entered the psychedelic field as enthusiasts for the movement. Yet we know when we love something, you must critique it. For the last few years, I've critiqued MAPS for their lack of inclusion of non-white study subjects. I've also witnessed the field and MAPS dismiss valid concerns from other critics and a refusal to engage those concerns. While some may see this hearing as a detraction, I see it as an opportunity to improve our movement and ensure consumer safety. After seeing the evidence of abuses, cross boundaries, and buried discrepancies, I've concluded that there needs to be more rigorous research on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy before it's brought to the public. As an advocate for ending the war on drugs, I believe that all drugs should be decriminalized and regulated. Yet there's a need for research-backed understanding and guidance on safe, effective use of psychedelics. Rigorous accountability standards and a moral degree of integrity are central to my commitment. I hope that after this hearing, the field starts to hold itself to a higher standard.
Hi, my name is Kayla Greenstein. I'm a psychology PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, and I used to work in sexual assault response. I have no financial disclosures. It's 4 a.m. in Australia, and I would rather not be awake right now, but I am deeply concerned about the Lykos model of MDMA-assisted therapy. When I started my PhD 2.5 years ago, I wanted to conduct a psychedelic clinical trial for PTSD. But as I looked at the psychotherapy component, I quickly realized there were very serious issues. My research now focuses on the theoretical underpinnings and use of touch in psychedelic therapies. I have read the Lykos Therapeutic Manual very closely, and I've read all of the references cited in the manual. The core idea of the therapy is that we all have an inner healing intelligence that can be accessed through MDMA and other non-ordinary states of consciousness. Given the centrality of the inner healing intelligence in their therapy manual and as a proposed mechanism of action, I'm really surprised we didn't hear more about it today from the sponsor. It was also really concerning to hear the sponsor say that MDMA-assisted therapy facilitates memory recollection. This is a highly controversial idea that sits alongside the idea that MDMA elicits a more authentic version of the self, connecting to the inner healer and archetypes in the collective unconscious. Using touch and body work to clear energy blocks in patients are also in the therapeutic manual. Much of the backing of the manual is based in New Age psycho-spiritual theory. It is Rick Doblin's goal to have a global spiritualized society by 2070. Controversial New Age psychiatrist Stan Groff comes up 14 times in the therapy manual. He believes all psychopathology is rooted in traumas in the birth canal. Here's his book and some of those diagrams. This includes homosexuality, which Groff believes is a dysfunction that comes from trauma in stage 3 of the birth process. Groff's work is homophobic and misogynistic. This is not a safe therapy model. These theories were an integral part of the phase 2 trial abuse, and we need a different therapeutic manual with contemporary co-designed research supporting it. I also recently published on the lack of mention or discussion of coercive control in MDMA couples therapy, where one person has PTSD. In response, MAPS-affiliated researchers attempted to have my work removed with baseless accusations. After a lengthy process, I demonstrated my critiques of their work were entirely accurate. There has been no recognition of the role of coercive control and increased vulnerability within couples and families in the treatment process. I am still hopeful about MDMA-assisted therapy, and I greatly look forward to seeing the research coming from labs that are not associated with MAPS and Lykos. I wish I could support this application. However, I believe approving this model of MDMA-assisted therapy would result in substantial further harms. I very much hope that if it is approved, I'm proven wrong about that. Thank you.
My name is Brian Pace. I am a lecturer teaching psychedelic studies in the Department of Plant Pathology at The Ohio State University. I am also a co-author of the citizen petition, which raised serious concerns about the NDA under review. I thank the FDA for granting extended time in this response to our petition. No conflicts. I submit that Lykos is a therapy cult that uses the application under review to further mystical and utopian goals. This lens explains the mounting allegations against them regarding research misconduct and clinical trial participant harms. In my paper, Right-Wing Psychedelia, I analyzed Lykos leadership's simply stated aims for instrumentalizing the drug under review to change people's beliefs as part of an ongoing project of global spiritual conversion. This spiritual conversion underlies their promise of solutions to more material concerns, like bringing about world peace or solving climate change. While these are not the first dubious promises to be made by applicants before this agency, they are perhaps the most grandiose. I'm obligated to state the obvious. MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD is not going to result in the, quote, spiritualization of humanity, unquote, and such claims are the prophecies of a therapy cult. Next slide. The FDA is under no obligation to evaluate these spiritual claims, but this agency is tasked with monitoring institutional review board compliance and act when study sponsors confess to casual human experimentation with the drug under consideration at Burning Man. That Lykos leadership felt comfortable admitting this while clinical trials were ongoing betrays a lack of internal accountability and an organizational culture of deep impunity. Lykos has exploited this lack of monitoring and sanction from the FDA. In fact, they're betting on it. Next slide. At South by Southwest this year, Lykos CEO Amy Emerson shared that patients presenting increased suicidal ideation is, quote, actually part of the process, unquote, of psychedelic therapy. In the same breath, she acknowledged that committing instances like these to medical records would be poorly received by gatekeepers of public health. Omission of adverse events is one of the specific allegations leveled against the applicant. As I mentioned in my written comment, an organization convinced it's on a mission to save the world might find justification of any means to do so. Next slide. But the FDA's broadest mission is that of protecting public health. Patients living with PTSD need rigorously tested care, not the faith healing of a therapy cult's latest rebrand of laying on of hands. The concerns I share today aren't about the safety of MDMA, but rather the people who have been administering and supervising this medicine. Harms and misconduct will scale if they are allowed to train and certify therapists. Thank you.
My name is Joe Welker. I'm the pastor of East Craftsbury Presbyterian Church in Craftsbury, Vermont. I have no financial relationships to report. I completed chaplaincy training at the Charles George VA Medical Center, where I worked with many veterans who suffer from PTSD. I know that condition is not trivial. I fully support and am grateful for anyone who has gotten and will get healing from MDMA for PTSD, including in this trial. But I also speak as a former member of the psychedelic industry before I became a whistleblower on a study at Johns Hopkins University, where funders and researchers with intimate ties to Lykos, then known as MAPS, advanced a religious and spiritual agenda that is shared by Lykos founder and executive director, Dr. Rick Doblin, as Dr. Pace has just described. I feel compelled to echo concerns warning the public of what is an openly known secret in the psychedelic industry, that, in the words of Dr. Doblin, his long-term desire is a, quote, spiritualized humanity, politically advancing this mission using the reputation of science. This study has functioned as that first politically savvy Trojan horse of that mission. As I submitted in written comments, while one may argue the legitimacy of psychedelic spiritual beliefs on their own merits, how do we trust data when a company not only has financial conflicts of interest, but open spiritual and religious conflicts of interest? And like the worst of religions, including my own, What happens when people are abused in the name of a religious mission? As we saw in these trials, they are often discarded, silenced, minimized for political gain, and tossed away as inconvenient. And so while I support anyone who gets healing from MDMA therapy, I'm here in support of people harmed in these trials, many other victims of psychedelic therapy abuse, all of their family and friends, former Lykos employees, academics, whistleblowers, the many who have spoken anonymously to the media, journalists, and others who have concerns about the intermingling of a utopian spiritual movement with science. I must also say there is a certain irony in questions earlier about risk assessment and whether participants increase in illicit use of MDMA. Both the FDA and the public should be aware that this study is run primarily by people with an extensive use of MDMA in illicit settings. It would be hard to find a bigger promoter of illicit MDMA use in American history than Dr. Doblin. Dr. Doblin's public advocacy gives the impression that Lykos leadership would think any increase in illicit use would not be a bug, but a feature. Again, I am a former psychonaut, and I do fully support people who got healing in this trial or elsewhere from psychedelics. And I support continuing research into MDMA therapy. But while Lykos leadership may envision a spiritualized humanity, in this very study, Lykos treated the people who were harmed under their care with a falsely spiritual inhumanity. Regardless of the decision made today and in August, the public deserves to know that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bo Witka. I just want to start off by saying it was very hard for me to join you today, and it was equally challenging for me to write the statement that I'm reading, since I currently find myself in the midst of what I openly describe as the most terrifying time of my life. The frightening state I'm in and a failure to cope with, to the best of my ability, began immediately following a single guided MDMA-assisted therapy session on February 19th, 2023. In spite of my difficulties and discomfort presenting to you, I want to be as candid as possible about my experience, since I'm living proof of the dangers of the therapy component of MDMA-assisted therapy, and I feel like I have a duty to educate and warn others about something I was completely ignorant of prior to my treatment last year, that MDMA can cause lasting harm to a client when administered under the guidance of an inept and/or inexperienced therapist. I'm determined to continue to share my story publicly so as to not allow what happened to me to happen to others. I have nothing against MDMA, and in fact, I know from personal experience that this drug has tremendous clinical potential for positive outcomes when administered correctly. In late 2022, I participated in a group journey where I was not working with a therapist. This experience was extremely positive and changed my life in ways that years of talk therapy could not. The MDMA that I consumed with this group came from the same source as the MDMA I was given on February 19th, 2023, which proves how impactful the role of a therapist can be. Speaking of therapists, it's important for me to note that the licensed therapist who guided me is a graduate of the California Institute of Integral Studies Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research, which trains therapists for MAPS clinical trials. She has a doctorate, many years of experience, various certificates, and claims to specialize in treating trauma. This experience has completely derailed my life. I've been able to work for the last 15 months, and I've had to live with a family member while I attempt to recover on my own. Just a few of the symptoms I've experienced on a daily basis, with often abrupt, inconsistent, and unpredictable fluctuations, include extreme exhaustion, brain fog, severe cognitive impairment, unrefreshing sleep, headaches, eye issues, and a long list that's too extensive to share with you today. I'm 100% pro MDMA and would like to see the drug legalized for therapeutic use. However, I cannot support MDMA-assisted therapy being allowed to go mainstream until more training and research is conducted to better understand how to avoid outcomes like mine, and more importantly, how to support people who experience extended difficulties. There is zero support for people like me and absolutely no safety net in place. I want to end by saying 2 years ago, this topic and meeting would have meant very little to me, but since February 19th of 2023, it has become an extremely personal subject. And thank you again for holding this hearing.
Distinguished members of the Psychopharmacologic Drugs Advisory Committee, thank you for your time and attention. My name is Sasha Sisko, and I have no financial relationships to disclose. Today, I will highlight 4 incidents of misconduct that raise significant ethical and legal concerns, which merit your urgent consideration. I speak as a survivor of PTSD. I will partially draw upon findings from my preprint entitled Omission of Serious Adverse Events within MAPS-sponsored clinical trial publications. First, MAPS founder and Lykos board director, Richard Doblin, PhD, has described the publicly available footage of the physical sexual assault of a MAPS phase 2 trial subject in the treatment room as depicting a, quote, technique involving, quote, psychodrama that, quote, can be beneficial in the context of psychotherapy. To wit, MAPS has published a book by Stan Groff entitled LSD Psychotherapy, which endorses, quote, sometimes inflicting pain, end quote, upon patients during, quote, intense psychodynamic struggles. Second, Dr. Doblin has proposed enrolling Ukrainians housed at refugee centers into a MAPS-sponsored clinical trial examining MDMA-assisted group psychotherapy in sessions involving upwards of 100 participants. Although Doblin has described such, quote, humanitarian projects as, quote, a risk that MAPS must take, his stated proposals violates the Nuremberg Code. Third, I have documented dozens of instances of Dr. Doblin promoting off-label use of MDMA-assisted couples therapy and, furthermore, encouraging the general population to practice MDMA psychotherapy as detailed in the MAPS treatment manual. Despite contacting the FDA and MAPS representatives about this, I have not, to my awareness, received a response to these matters. Fourth, I have reported on footage depicting a MAPS trial subject informing multiple MAPS researchers that they engaged in suicidal behavior during their clinical trial after their first MDMA treatment session. However, the relevant trial publication claims that no suicidal behavior occurred, quote, during the treatment period after dosing. I can provide this footage to the FDA upon request. It should be noted that Dr. Doblin famously criticized another psychedelic researcher for omitting a serious adverse event from their publications, stating that, quote, there is no justification for this omission, no matter how unfairly the critics of this research may have used this information, and no matter how minimal the negative persisting effects reported by the subject. In conclusion, I urge the FDA and its Office of Criminal Investigations to thoroughly investigate these substantiated allegations to ensure compliance with federal laws and FDA regulations while safeguarding the public's safety as well as the safety of patients. Thank you for your attention. I yield my time.
Hello, my name is Sarah Grosh. I am a proxy reading a statement for Meaghan Buisson. My name is Meaghan Buisson. I'm a phase 2 clinical trial participant directly recruited into this study by Lykos. I was so scared of being touched, I initially turned them down. They called me again a year later, desperate for help. I agreed. I moved provinces for the trial. The trial sponsor failed to obtain full informed consent. The day before my first session, they found an omission to my screening, which should have excluded me. Instead, Lykos broke its exclusionary criteria and kept me in the study. Regarding the assaults I suffered in the clinical trial, I will not be going into detail. There is a video clip widely available online. The fact that it and my name are public is extremely difficult. It should never have been necessary. In September of 2021, I submitted a statement to the FDA as part of a formal complaint. In it, I made the FDA aware of abusive practices normalized by the clinical framework. In these practices included being blindfolded, gagged, pinned, cuddled, and caressed. All things I specifically indicated I did not consent to prior to MDMA dosing. Video evidence confirms physical and sexual assaults within those active sessions. I became suicidal during the trial, leading to a near-miss attempt. Lykos was informed and chose not to document it. Undoubtedly, it was an adverse event, and they hid it. The clinical trial shattered me. Overwhelmingly vulnerable, I was trafficked by my therapist while still in the clinical trial. The first physician to treat my wounds after I escaped said I was, quote, drugged, raped, blamed, and held as a sex slave, end quote. Members of Lykos's leadership team, a principal investigator, and several phase 3 therapists witnessed my abuses firsthand. No one did a thing. Lykos still maintains that, quote, monitoring of study records throughout the course of the trial and afterwards did not indicate signs of ethical violation, end quote. This is false. Even after my assaults, Lykos insists on employing unlicensed, unregulated individuals. This raises serious questions about ethics, patient safety, and informed consent. Vulnerable patients have no recourse when harms occur. What I experienced wasn't just two bad therapists. It was a predictable outcome of preventable harms and failures of Lykos. It is gutting to know that individuals in phase 3 have suffered similar harms even after I alerted the FDA in 2021. I now struggle with new PTSD symptoms alongside my original ones. I suffer from crippling anxiety and a pervasive distrust of healthcare providers. These harms are magnified by Lykos's relentless efforts to skirt their responsibility by pushing a false narrative of misogynistic rape myths. This is disgusting institutionalized abuse. The sponsor lied to the committee about adverse events and safety monitoring. Trial videos must be independently reviewed. I urge the FDA to seriously consider its responsibility for patient safety and reconsider the veracity of Lykos's claims. Thank you.
Thank you.